Welcome everyone. We'll just give it a couple of more minutes to let people join us. Okay, I think we can make a start. So welcome to the first IIRSM South East of England branch webinar of 2025. Thank you all for joining. So as a member and volunteer of St John Ambulance, first aid and emergency response is a subject that's really close to my heart. So I'm delighted to be welcoming Kate Joy today. Kate is a National Business Development Manager for Difex Solutions Limited, and she will be talking through a possible alternative to water in a chemical response, incident response. So I'll hand you over to Kate. Thank you very much, Kate.
Lovely, thanks, Lauren. Yeah, first aid's very dear to my heart as well. So today I want to take you through chemical first aid in general so that we all have an understanding. We'll have a look at what chemicals cause an injury, how those injuries develop, what our first aid needs to do, and then what our first aid options are, because you may find yourself in a situation with one or the other. So I think it's really important we understand all of the options and the limits and benefits of them all, and then talk about an alternative which may just help out in a lot of situations. Let me share my screen with you so we can see the presentation. That seems to be working okay. Before I start, just a word of warning that I have got pictures of chemical injuries in the presentation. So if anybody is squeamish, I will try and give you a warning before they come up, give you a heads up, and please feel free to look away. There's no kind of better thing to do than actually avoid an accident. So all the work that you do around risk assessments and the hierarchy of controls is really important. It's important that we don't come into contact with chemicals. It's the best thing that can happen. But if we do, then we need a really effective first aid to manage that situation. And that's the bit I want to concentrate on today. Firstly, what chemicals can cause us an injury? And now everything I say today, whilst aiming at those that generally work with chemicals, we also have to consider the more malicious acts that are happening these days as well, like the corrosive or the acid attacks, and everything I say works just as well for both. So the chemicals that cause us an injury, everybody's aware chemicals are always clearly labelled to give us an indication of their risks. And chemicals can carry more than one risk. You know, this little mini acetone I have here shows that it's both irritant and flammable. So chemicals can have more than one risk, but the two risks I want us to focus on today are corrosives and irritants, because they're the two that are going to give us a chemical injury. And when we think about those, sometimes people don't understand the differences between the two. The way I describe the two, anything that falls into the irritant category, I would describe as being a low energy state. The effects that that chemical has on our tissues is generally reversible. So you'll get some soreness or redness, but generally your body will repair the damage. If the chemical's corrosive, that chemical's in a high energy state, that comes into contact with you, the chances are that that damage will be irreversible. You may need a skin graft or a corneal graft to overcome that damage. Now, when we talk about decontamination, I would treat both corrosives and irritants the same. Couple of reasons. One, you often haven't got time to identify which group it falls into before you carry out your first aid. And two, we want everybody to go home without any form of injury. So I will decontaminate corrosives and irritants in the same way. Now, when these chemicals come into contact with us, what happens is there's an aggressor in the chemical that will get through the protective outer layer of your skin or your eyes. And as it gets into the deeper layers, it finds a target molecule to react with, and it causes cellular destruction. That's our chemical injury. And you'll notice I tend to talk about them as chemical injuries rather than chemical burns, because we've had burns first aid for years and it involves using water. But there's actually a really different process going on. A thermal burn is very different to a chemical injury. If I take away a heat source, a thermal burn stops. We might use water to cool it down a bit quicker, but the thermal burn essentially stops. With a chemical, once those aggressors are in the tissues, that chemical will keep reacting until there's nothing left for it to react with. So they're much harder to stop. How serious the injury is that we get from a chemical injury depends on a number of factors. First factor is the type of chemical that we come into contact with. And there are actually 7 different aggressors that can cause us damage. So we have acids, bases, oxidizers, reducers, chelators, solvents, and alkylating agents. They all react with us slightly differently. So, for example, if you were working with acids, now that might be sulfuric acid or nitric acid or hydrochloric acid or any of the hundreds that are out there. In all the acids, though, the damaging bit is an H+ ion. That H+ ion reacts with proteins in your tissues. You get coagulative necrosis. You get your injury. If I was to go the other end of the pH scale to a base, so something like sodium hydroxide caustic or ammonia, or even things like cement and lime, they're all bases. Damaging bit is a hydroxide ion. That hydroxide ion reacts with fats in your tissues. You get liquefactive necrosis. You still get a chemical injury, but it's a different reaction. And in fact, alkalis are pretty grim because they turn your fat to soap. They liquefy the fat. They keep creeping. It sets up this kind of chain reaction, really difficult to stop. They are probably the most common injury that ends up in the NHS, so difficult to stop. So it depends what the aggressor is as to how serious your injury might be. Second factor that affects severity is concentration. The more concentrated a chemical is, the more aggressive it is, the more damage it's going to cause. Temperature and pressure will have an effect as well. If I heat a chemical up or I put a chemical under pressure, I give it more energy. If I give it more energy, it's going to cause more damage. The final factor that affects how serious an injury is time, exposure time or contact time. The longer the chemical remains in contact with the tissue, the more opportunity those aggressors have to diffuse into the tissues, the more damage is going to be caused. And you notice I've got that one highlighted. And it's highlighted for a very good reason. It's because it's the only one a responder has any control over. It's the only one you can do anything about. You couldn't change what chemical somebody came into contact with, or you couldn't change its concentration. But what you can do is respond really quickly. If we get that chemical off that tissue, we'll limit the severity of the injury. So time is really important to a responder. Now, I said I've got pictures coming up. If anybody wants to look away, please do so now. We'll see here, I've got an acid injury at one end of the scale. The other end of the scale, ammonia, injury to the eye. So acid and base, both ends of the pH scale. In the middle, these are injuries after healing. You may recognise the lady. Nobody knew what chemical had been thrown the day that incident happened, but they had to decontaminate her. So it just goes to show that whatever you use to decontaminate somebody, it has to be a global response. It has to work at both ends of the pH scale. We haven't got time to choose a decontaminant. We need to respond quickly. And these incidents, when they happen, difficult. For a casualty, it may be loss of sight for them. It might be scarring, psychological difficulties. They may never work again. But it doesn't just affect them. It will go on to affect their friends, their family, their social life. You've probably, many of you heard the story of Ken Woodward at Coca-Cola, who had a really significant injury, lost his sight. And he talks very candidly about the effect that it had on his home life. He never saw his children grow up, the depression that he went through. But he also talks a lot about what it did for his colleagues at work. You know, for a business, there may be financial and legal costs, but those human costs are awful. A lot of Ken's colleagues couldn't return to work after witnessing the incident. So there's a really wide knock-on effect from these incidents. Now, I said time was really important. I just want to explain why. So my graph we've got on the y-axis, this is the gravity or the severity of the injury. And along the bottom, we're looking at time. When a chemical comes into contact with us, for the first 10 seconds, the protective outer layer on our skin or our eyes, it tries to resist, it tries to keep that chemical out. After about 10 seconds, the chemical starts to diffuse into the deeper layers. And you'll see that the damage is just starting to increase. And between 10 seconds and a minute, the damage that's caused is generally still reversible. If we get past that minute point, you can see how quickly that tissue destruction takes off. And then often beyond that point, the damage is irreversible. It's going to require surgery. So we can see time is really important. And I can try to show you with a little video. What we have here is eye tissue under a microscope. So those white cells are healthy cells. Some of them are going to be sight cells. Washing in from the right, and this is filmed in real time, is 0.5 molar sodium hydroxide. Can we see how quickly as that diffuses through the tissues that those cells are destroyed? So once chemical gets deep in our layers, destruction's pretty quick. If we again just think about how our tissue's made up, it helps to illustrate this point. The protective outer layer of your eye, epithelium, stroma, and endothelium. For your skin, it's the corneal layer, epidermis and dermis. If we can respond quickly to an incident and keep chemical at that protective outer layer, chances are damage will be reversible. If the chemical penetrates into those deep layers, then that's when we start to see that irreversible damage. So time is really critical when we talk about responding. Now, thankfully, chemical incidents aren't that common. About 3% of the burns that end up in hospital are from chemicals. But whilst it's a low incident rate, 30% of the deaths from burns come from chemical injuries. So low incident rate, but really high fatality rate. So it's important that we do have an ability to respond effectively. Now, I guess if an incident were to happen, we have 3 options of response. Our first option might be grab the casualty, bundle them up, put them in the back of the car and get them to hospital. Now, based on travel times to hospital, time it takes to get triaged, get through the front door, and the time that decontamination would start, I reckon we're at least an hour in at this point. If we're waiting an hour to start first aid, chances are damage will be irreversible. Our second option could be to call a paramedic, let them manage the situation. Again, possibly an optimistic 15-minute arrival time on this slide. But, you know, if we're waiting for a paramedic to arrive before first aid starts, again, chances are damage will be irreversible. If we have really effective first aid and good protocols on site, everybody's trained in them, then the chances are a responder could manage that incident within the first minute. And if we can do that, that really does make the difference between a casualty being stuck in hospital waiting for surgery or back at work the next day. It's that stark. So good protocols are really important. So what does our first aid that we're going to deliver have to do? We have to do 2 things with our first aid. First thing we need to do is flush the chemical off the tissues. If the chemical isn't in contact, we're going to limit diffusion, we'll limit the damage. So good, effective flushing is really important. Second thing we have to do with our first aid is get our tissue to a safe pH. Now, for anybody who's not familiar or has forgotten all they ever knew about pH, pH measures how acidic or how basic chemicals are. We have this neutral point in the middle. Anything that's got a number below 7 is an acid, anything with a number above 7, base. Either end of our pH scale, chemicals are really aggressive. They will cause damage pretty much immediately on contact. So what we aim to do with our first aid is to drive that concentration down. we're going to head towards that neutral point. Now, if I'm honest with you, you won't get to a pH of 7. I bet if you tested the water in your facility, if you're going to use water as a decontaminant, its pH is going to be about 7.5. Certainly not going to be 7. Our skin naturally has a pH somewhere around 5.5. So we'll never get to 7 if we were testing the area. So what we aim to do is to get the tissue into what they call a safe physiological pH. If I can get the pH between 5.5 and 9, the chemical no longer has the ability to aggress the tissues. So that's our safe physiological pH. So first aid needs to do 2 things: flush the chemical away, get to a safe pH. Now, I want you to all have a little think. This incident, this guy here, gasket's gone on the seal, on the pipe, he's covered in, let's say it's caustic, sodium hydroxide. We need to respond. If you had an incident like this happen on your site, think about the methods we have to decontaminate somebody. How would you manage that incident currently? And what might the difficulties be? And normally I do a bit of a Q&A here, but not so easy. So have a little think, and I've got a list we'll compare. First one on my list is panic. That casualty is going to be really shocked, really frightened, in pain. They're going to panic. Their response to the situation, you know, we're not going to know what they might do. I have a feeling as well there's going to be a little bit of panic from responders and bystanders. These aren't situations we deal with often, so panic's going to be a big factor. We've seen already, haven't we, that we've got a really short time to start the washing process. We have to start really quickly. So, you know, where are our facilities for that washing process? How quickly can we get to them? Where is the casualty? I've had the pleasure of being on lots of different sites, you know, and there are mezzanine floors, there's gantries, there's service corridors. I was on a water treatment works the other day. The engineer was working 6 foot down in a chemical bund, concrete chemical bund around a 10,000 litre tank, but he's 6 foot down. How am I going to get to him to deliver first aid? If we need to get the casualty to something like a drenched shower, if that's our options, then I've got to take that casualty from where the incident is to where that drenched shower is. Now, if he's panicking, he's covered in chemical, that could be really difficult. You know, we've got cross-contamination risks there for the responder. So we need to be thinking about what PPE we need to wear to assist him. If I do get him to a drenched shower, and I don't know if you're aware, there's a bit of legislation that covers drenched showers. It's a British standard. It's EN 15154. That guidance states that your drenched shower should be within 10 seconds of where you're working with the chemicals. It needs to deliver for your skin 60 litres a minute for 15 minutes. So we need 900 litres of water to decontaminate somebody. For our eyes, the recommendation is 6 litres a minute for 15 minutes. In addition to that, that shower should be heated between 15 and 37 degrees C. So it should deliver warm-ish water. In 9 years that I've been doing this job, I've only been on 2 sites where the showers are fully heated. More often than not, they're heated to stop the pipes freezing in the winter. They have trace heating. But, you know, minute or so in, they're pulling in mains cold water. Your casualty has a requirement to stay in that shower for 15 minutes for effective decontamination. If you're pulling mains cold water, can you imagine today, stripped naked in the yard, standing under a cold water shower and being expected to stay there for 15 minutes? The casualty is going to fight you to get out. If we do manage to keep them in there for 15 minutes, we may have introduced hypothermia, further risks, further complications. Eyes can be a particular issue. We were talking about this before I started. If we get something in our eye, you know, if you're in the shower in the morning and you get shampoo in your eye, the first response your eye makes is to shut. It feels the pain, it shuts to protect itself. The proper term for that is blepharospasm. It's a reflex response from your eye. So if you need to wash somebody's eye, first thing you've got to do is actually get their eyelids apart so that you can start the flushing process. And for anybody who's ever used a saline eye wash, they'll know how difficult that is, and they'll probably know how much the saline ends up in the eye and not down the casualty's front. So washing eyes can be really difficult. Showers may not work. You know, not every site trace heats their showers. I've been to sites that their showers regularly freeze. I've been to sites where there's been rubbish accumulated under the step plate on the shower and the showers haven't worked. So we need to make sure that we're maintaining them regularly. And then there's always the accident investigation at the end that we need to do. So there could be lots of difficulties around managing these incidents. So what we need are really effective protocols in place that we can try to overcome some of those difficulties. So what should your first aid protocol look like? I guess I can probably sum it up in 3 words. And you've probably heard them before on many a government document, and they are remove, remove, remove. They are the main 3 stages. The first thing you do is remove yourself from danger if you can, and raise the alarm. It's really important to shout for help. You're going to need assistance to manage this situation. I had a young lady in a lab, and she'd been dealing with some waste chemical. She poured it into the acid waste container as she should have done. There was a reaction. The chemical sprayed out and she was hit in the face. Now, she thought she'd made a mistake. But somebody else had put something in that waste container that they shouldn't have done. It wasn't her, it was the previous person. But she got hit in the face by the chemicals. Because she was a bit embarrassed and a bit worried that she'd made a mistake, instead of sounding the alarm, she left the lab. Down 3 flights of stairs. 20 minutes later, the team found her in the toilets, trying to wash her face in the sink in the toilet facilities. Not effective decontamination. If she'd have just stopped and said what had happened, she'd have been given instant first aid. So it's really important that we raise the alarm. The next remove that we do is to remove clothing. You cannot decontaminate somebody with their clothes on. We need this good flushing action. You know, the first thing our first aid needs to do is flush the chemical away, and clothing is going to prevent that. Again, I was at a site where they'd had an incident. An engineer walking away, a bit similar to the picture we saw just now. He was walking away from a pipe when the gasket went, and he was sprayed with caustic all the way down his back. Now, the site stripped him off really quickly, good procedures, and started to decontaminate him. But because of modesty, they didn't take his pants off. And that poor lad, the only place he got a burn was his backside. He didn't sit down for 6 weeks. You know, I'm afraid modesty has to go out the window. Contaminated clothing needs to be removed. Our final remove is to remove the contamination. And we have to follow the instructions based on the decontaminant that we're using. And we'll look at what our options are next. Final step on my protocol is always to get a medical checkup. As we saw at the beginning, chemicals can have more than one risk. So it's really important that we have managed all of those. So what are our options when we talk about decontamination? Our first one's water. It's readily available, it's a valid response, and it's been the go-to for years. And water will do the same thing to all chemicals. It will flush it from the surface and it will dilute it. You know, the solution to pollution is dilution. I think we've all heard that phrase. We need 60 litres a minute for 15 minutes for our skin. We need 6 litres a minute for 15 minutes for our eyes. We have to bear in mind initially that water will move quite concentrated chemical around the body. So just be a little bit conscious about how you carry out this decontamination. Have your casualty on their feet if you can. If you sit a casualty down and wash them, all that's going to happen is the chemical will wash down, they'll be sat in a corrosive puddle. When we wash eyes, be really careful that we flush away. We don't want to wash across the face, move chemical from one eye to perhaps an unaffected eye. So we tilt to one side, we flush away. Be very conscious if you're the responder. Anything coming off that casualty might be a cross-contamination risk to you. So do be conscious of your own PPE, your own safety in that process. So water, valid response. However, it has some limits. If we understand the limits, we can get the best out of it. The main limit with water comes from the fact that it's hypotonic. Funny word. Hypo, that bit means lack of. We had hypothermia just now. That was lack of pressure. Oh, sorry, lack of temperature. Hypotonicity is lack of pressure or lack of concentration. If you think you're made up of blood, sweat, and tears, they've all got salt in, so you're concentrated. Water's got very little dissolved in it. It's got a lack of concentration. It's hypotonic. Now, this is important. If you understand osmosis, osmosis makes water move from areas of low concentration to areas of high concentration. So water is naturally attracted into your tissues. You know that happens. Think about it. You sit in a bath for 10 or 15 minutes, you quickly start to notice, particularly around your fingers and toes, that they start to go puffy. That's this hypertonicity in action. That's water being drawn in, and it particularly shows up on your fingers and toes because of how the skin's tethered. So we know water's drawn into our tissues due to this imbalance, this osmotic imbalance. So think about that in chemical first aid. Somebody's come into contact with a chemical, that chemical starts to diffuse into their tissues. If we then flush the tissue with water for 15 minutes, if that water's drawn in, what we can do is push the chemical deeper. As that water's drawn in, it'll push the chemical deeper. So we do have what we call the washing effect, and it gives us some unreliability when we talk about using water. The other thing with water, it's a passive response. It will flush the chemical away and it will dilute it, but it'll do that at the surface of the tissues. So water can't stop the chemical diffusing. In fact, it might assist it. And it also can't get any chemical back out of the tissues because it's passive, it's working on the surface. I don't know if anybody recognised the lady in the picture earlier. That central picture was Katie Piper. She had acid thrown on her by, it was arranged by her ex-boyfriend. After her incident, they washed her with water for 23 hours to try to get the pH under control. 23 hours. So water can have limits. Once that chemical's diffused in, we're not going to get it back out. It's difficult to get tissue back to a safe pH. And if we go back to the information I said earlier about our drench showers needing to be within 10 seconds of where we're working with the chemicals, hopefully this helps to explain that bit of the legislation. If our tissue resists for 10 seconds and then the chemical starts to diffuse, if water can't stop diffusion, then you need to start your decontamination in the first 10 seconds. Hopefully that helps explain that legislation. So valid response, but limits. Another response we have available to us is saline. You're probably all very familiar with saline eye wash bottles. And saline is going to do just the same as water. It will flush and dilute chemical at the surface of the tissue. But I don't know if you've ever thought as to why there's saline in those eye wash bottles. And if I ask this question, I often get a response, or it's there because it makes the water sterile. I can put sterile water in a bottle. The reason we've got saline in your eye wash bottles is to improve our first aid. Our eyes are a lot more sensitive to chemical damage. You think about it. You wash your hands with soap, it doesn't hurt. If we splash that same soap in your eye, it stings. The protective outer layer is not as good at keeping chemical out in our eyes. And if chemical gets into our eyes and destroys cells, the consequence could be a loss of vision, and that could be catastrophic. So we wanted better first aid. So what we did was add something to the water to make it better. If you put 0.9% salt in water, it makes the solution isotonic. Isotonic means it's got the same osmotic pressure as the tissue in your eye. So if I flush an eye with saline, I'm going to flush the chemical away, but this time, because of that balance, we're not going to push chemical deeper. So that's a better response for our first aid. However, saline is still passive. It can't stop diffusion. It's not going to assist it like water does, but it can't stop it. And it can do nothing to get the chemical back out of our tissues. But again, a valid response. We now understand where the limits around it lie. Now, there is an alternative, a third response, which you may not be aware of. It was developed by a company called Provor. They were safety shower manufacturers. But they could see people weren't walking away without injury, even if they followed protocols. So they sought to do better. And back in 93, they developed a product that they called diphoterine. I know it's not a catchy name, diphoterine. You do get used to it. Its official title, if you don't like diphoterine, you can give it its full name. That's a hypertonic amphoteric chelating agent. Not a lot easier, but it does actually explain what it does. Diphoterine's still a liquid. You know, if I was to show you a product, it's still got a good flushing action. It's water-based. It will flush the chemical away. So we've still got a good surface washing. But what they've done is add something to the water to improve your response. So you've got a diphoterine molecule sitting in that solution. That molecule, if you imagine it, it's got all over its surface different sites. And each of those sites has the ability to attract, bind, and render harmless a different aggressor. So if somebody come into contact with an acid, the H+ ion gets attracted to the diphoterine molecule binds to it, and it renders that harmful molecule inert. It's bound to it. It can't react with us. If it was a base, so the hydroxide ion damaging bit, again, goes to the diphoterine molecule, the molecule binds to it, renders it harmless. And it can do that for acids, bases, oxidizers, reducers, chelators, solvents, and alkylating agents. So if it's corrosive or irritant, diphoterine has the ability to manage it. The benefits in a washing solution for a first aider. I'm binding the aggressor. So I've got an active wash. Because the wash is now active, I need less of it. And if I need less of it, I can now have portable first aid. So it means I can take the first aid to the casualty. I haven't got to get that casualty to a fixed and plumbed in drench out. So I take away some of the difficulties around the panic, the moving the casualty, where are they situated, what are the cross-contamination risks to me. So it starts to make our protocols easier. When it's binding the aggressor, when I decontaminate somebody with diphoterine, the runoff that you create is non-corrosive. So you don't spread the area of injury across their body. So it's safer for them and it's safer for any responder. The other side effect you get to all that, imagine if a chemical's attacking you, it's really painful. If you bind the aggressor and stop that process, you're going to take pain down. And if we can take pain out of a situation, things get much calmer. Our decontamination becomes much easier. So that's the amphoteric chelating bit that I used in that name. Amphoteric just means it works equally well with acids and bases, both ends of the pH scale. And chelating is this binding action. If you're not a scientist, I was training some doctors a while back, and one of them said to me, he said, "Oh, it's easy." He said, "Diphoterine's a bit like Pac-Man then, isn't it? It comes along and it gobbles up the baddies." And I always think that's quite a good way of thinking about it. The other thing with the diphoterine, it's hypertonic. So water was hypotonic, it had a lack of pressure. Saline was isotonic, same pressure. Diphoterine's hypertonic. It's got a much greater pressure than you. So if osmosis goes from low to high, if I flush with a high concentration, what I'm going to do is create a draw out of the tissues. So now I have the ability to stop and reverse diffusion. I can get the chemical out, I can get the tissue back to a safe pH. The ability to do that, therefore, opens up our window of response from 10 seconds to a minute. So our first aid response becomes a lot more practical. Just to try and show you all of that, I've got a little video. This guy has come into contact with acid and they're using the diphoterine spray to decontaminate it. Now, what's happening at the surface of the tissues, the H+ ions are coming into contact. After about 10 seconds, they'll diffuse into our tissues. When you start to wash with the diphoterine, anything on the surface is first flushed away, but at the same time bound to the diphoterine molecule, rendering it harmless. Anything in the tissue, due to this osmotic draw, gets pulled out, still bound to the molecule and flushed away. So we get our tissue back to a safe pH. So we get a much more effective decontamination. So if I use diphoterine in the first minute, I can use one container to fully decontaminate a set area of tissue. And to give you an example, a 200 ml spray would decontaminate all of the face, or our 5 litre portable shower, looks a bit like a fire extinguisher, that's head to toe decontamination. The whole process is much quicker. So if I use one container in the first minute, I know I've done the job. It'll decontaminate at any concentration. But if I don't get there in the first minute, then diphotoring will still have a benefit. We just have to use our delayed wash protocol. Now, I can't unburn burnt tissue with diphotoring. It's a medical device. It's not a miracle device. But I will limit damage. And if I limit damage quick enough, often the body can self-repair over time and we can avoid surgery. And this delayed wash protocol is why London Ambulance Service carry it. It's why diphotoring's in the major burns units and lots of EDs, because it does have a benefit up to 24 hours after a splash. In a delayed wash, I need to use more than one container. So I'll use one immediately, the whole contents, just to flush the chemical away and manage the situation as quickly as I can. And then I'll keep the diphotoring in contact with the area just to continue working to pull that chemical out, and we'll get that tissue back to a safe pH. To give you a quick example of this, we had a lady at a bus stop, and there are more pictures of eye injuries coming up in a moment. So ladies at a bus stop and somebody throws ammonia at her, hits her in one eye. At that bus stop, she's got no first aid. She decided her best option was to take herself to hospital. When she arrived at hospital, this was her eye. So she had a Roper Hall grade 4 burn. Eye burns go 1 to 4, the scale. So 4's as bad as it gets. Her vision, so 20/20 perfect vision, hers is 220 at this point, really limited. An ophthalmologist seeing damage like this generally starts to be thinking about corneal grafting. But he can do nothing at this point. She's had no first aid. So we need to get that pH under control. He's got diphotoring. He washes her immediately with one container, flush everything away quickly, and then keeps dosing the eye every minute or so with a second container. He's keeping the diphotoring in contact, and he's pulling that chemical out, getting the tissue to a safe pH. After the second bottle, this is her. Now, corneal grafting, lots of risks. You've got risk of surgery. You've got risk of infection. You've got risk the cornea is rejected. So if he can avoid surgery, he will. He knows he's got the pH under control. He can see there's still some good blood supply there. Tissue hasn't been completely destroyed. So he believes he can support that eye to repair and avoid surgery. So he gave her ascorbic acid drops and he gave her antibiotics to avoid any infection. And at her 6-month checkup, that's her. Her vision is back at 14/20 then, 16/20 by the end of the year. So we can have a benefit, even a delayed response. The longer it is, the harder we have to work, but it gives us that benefit. Once chemicals penetrated into the tissues, we really struggle to manage a situation with water. So with diphotoring being your protocol, what does it mean for your first aid? We still follow the same protocols. We're going to remove ourselves from danger and raise the alarm. We are going to remove contaminated clothing. And we're going to remove the contamination. But this time, if we use the full container on a set area of tissue, we know we've dealt with that chemical at any concentration. There's no guesswork. I still recommend everybody gets a medical checkup though. Chemicals can have more than one risk, as we said. There are various formats of diphotoring. It is completely safe on skin, eyes, mucous membranes, damaged tissue. It's what they call a class 2A medical device. So it has to be fully tested for efficacy and sterility. It meets the requirements of EN 15154. So you can replace your drench showers with a diphotoring portable shower. It's completely maintenance free. But it means that, imagine you've got an engineer who needs to break into a chemical pipeline and there isn't a drench shower by that pipeline. Now we can write into the protocols, the safe system of work, that he takes a diphotoring shower with him. Your first aid can go wherever the risk is. So take away those difficulties. So anybody can use diphotoring. You don't have to be a first aider. We just need to understand the protocols. It's completely safe on skin, eyes, mucous membranes, damaged tissue. So if somebody gets a face full of chemical, often it runs down into the ears. And nobody thinks about washing the ears out and then protecting the eardrum, but we can put diphotoring into the ear canal, You get the casualty to empty it out. You could spray out somebody's nostrils if you needed to. You could even put diphoterine into somebody's mouth, get them to wash it round and spit it out. I couldn't say that you could make somebody drink diphoterine if they've drunk chemical. That would be outside of its license. However, it's been done on several occasions in hospital. You know, we had somebody went into a lab, a chemistry lecture, and took a can of Coke with them. When they went off to the toilets, their friends, and I use that term loosely, emptied the Coke out of the can and put sodium hydroxide in it. And he came back and drunk sodium hydroxide. He ended up in hospital. They phoned us and said, what do we do? Can we give him diphoterine to drink? We know it's non-toxic. We said, yes, under clinical governance, that's fine. We took product down to the hospital, additional products to manage the situation. And he drank the diphoterine and he survived the incident. So it's been done outside of its license generally for a responder, but been done in hospital. You can't make a situation worse with diphoterine. If you used it and it turned out it wasn't chemical, we can't make the situation worse. You know, there are going to be no reactions there. The only way really anybody can hurt somebody with a bottle of diphoterine is to throw it at them. So it does mean that it's, you know, really easy for all staff to use. And it comes in a variety of formats that make it really portable. So diphoterine will work on all irritants and corrosives. If you're working with hydrofluoric acid or any of its derivatives, diphoterine has limited efficacy. It works fine on the acid, but if anybody's come across HF, it has two problems. It's corrosive from the H+ ions and it's toxic from the fluoride ions. The fluoride ions, when they get into our bodies, they chelate calcium. And if you take lots of calcium out of your body, when I mention HF, everybody says, oh, it dissolves your bones. Kind of does, because it takes calcium out. But if you take too much calcium out of your systems, you get hypocalcemia, lack of calcium. Now, calcium is the thing that keeps your heart beating nice and regularly. You take calcium out, your heart goes into ventricular fibrillation and then stops. So we've got a lethal effect potentially from HF. So we recommend hexafluorine. It's a sister product to diphoterine if you ever come across HF. And HF is beginning to creep into our lives. You know, it's a very controlled chemical. But these days, we all rely a lot on lithium-ion batteries. And the electrolyte in a lithium-ion battery is lithium hexafluorophosphate. When a battery catches fire or is damaged and that electrolyte comes into contact with the atmosphere, it makes HF. So we are starting to see a lot more issues around that in our day-to-day life around these lithium-ion batteries. Hopefully that's given you a good overview of diphoterine, an alternative response to water, and an effective response. If anybody's got any questions, I'd be really happy to answer them.
Thanks ever so much, Kate. Yeah, if anyone has any questions, please do put them in the Q&A box. We've got a couple that have come in already, so I'll start with this one. Our site first aiders trained on COSH hazards and COSH emergency?
I would hope that everybody trains their first aiders on site around the risks that are there. I mean, I can only talk about what we do with diphoterine. If somebody decides to install diphoterine on site, we give full training, and that training will be around, you know, we'll do a bit on ERIC PD because that's the most important bit. If you can avoid an incident, you know, it's great. So the thing is, you know, make sure you have those controls in place. Make sure we're all wearing our PPE. But we do need to know what to do when it goes wrong. So if people do install diphoterine, then we'll train them on all of the methods of first aid, you know, an extended version of what we've done today, plus how to use diphoterine effectively.
So we have a question from Robert. Does the Resus Council accept this use, and can we add it to our EFAWs, FAW courses?
So it is recommended by the Faculty of Pre-Hospital Care and the British Burns Association. It's within the Burns consensus, and as I say, it's carried by London Ambulance Service and in the hospitals. So yes, I know that it's going to be included in the syllabus for FREC 3, which is a responders emergency course, and it's going into that syllabus very shortly, and I'm up at trauma care training around that in a couple of weeks' time. So yes, it can go into the syllabus. It can be discussed. I don't think that it's kind of officially been written into those plans, but it's really important that if you are working with a site that has difotterine, that the staff are aware, and you're providing that as part of that specific training to the site, because they've moved away from water to an alternative.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can speak on behalf of my company. I train first aid, both the emergency first aid at work and first aid at work courses, and we make it specific to our site, so we do include that in our syllabus as well, so that you can be flexible with the syllabuses. For sure. Thanks, Kate. We've got a recommendation for the product in the chat. So in terms of everyone's sort of environmentally conscious these days, what kind of sustainability benefits does using difotterine as an alternative offer? Yeah,
if we have a drench shower, we have to maintain it weekly. We have to make sure it's going to be used, safe to use in emergency. So most people have a weekly schedule. So during that schedule, they'll be checking its operation and flushing it. So they'll be releasing litres and litres of water. There's a time involved in doing that as well. There's a cost to somebody's time doing the maintenance. The shower should be heated between 15 and 37 degrees C, so that we're not putting a casualty under cold water. The cost of keeping water at that temperature all year is quite considerable. And we have to do Legionella testing. You're introducing another risk by keeping water in that 15 to 30 degrees C temperature, because we raise the risk of Legionella. So by having difotterine, it's maintenance free. I can show you very quickly. This is our portable shower. So make sure that you can't see it now, can we? This is a full body shower. That's completely maintenance free. So it can sit in its protective box until it's needed, moved around if we need to, but it needs no maintenance. And in 2 years' time, we run a circular economy on them. So when it goes out of its shelf life, and that shelf life's around its sterility, we send you a replacement and the other one comes back. And that then gets refilled and re-sterilised. So we keep this circular economy as well. So from a sustainability point of view, lack of energy, that we don't need to put into keeping water hot every day of the year. Real benefit for people.
Yeah, and I think you've answered the next question that's come in, what the shelf life of the product is. Yeah. So that'll be the 2 years.
Yeah, so it is 2 years, and that literally is around sterility. That's the main driver of that, and that's governed by the MHRA and the medical devices regulations. Difotterine molecule doesn't stop working at 2 years, but because it's a class 2A medical device and we can use it on damaged tissue, it has to be sterile.
Let's have a look. I don't think anything else has come in just yet.
Okay. I don't know if anybody's, I'll just show you one other kind of feature of these, because if you've ever used a saline eye wash bottle on somebody, you'll know how difficult it is, because you've got to fight to get their eyelids open, and we're trying to flush away. So Prevor were really clever when they thought about these. To use them, you just pop the top. But you'll notice it's got a little eye cup and a valve in there that just stops all of the solution coming out at once, because when you do that with the saline eye wash, it's gone down the front. But the casualty can administer this themselves, or you can assist them in the process, because all we have to do is put that eye cup to the eye socket and tilt the head back, and then we squeeze the bottle gently. So the bottle, that little bit of pressure that the cup makes on the eye, just pops the eyelid open. You haven't got to hold the casualty's eyelid open. The bottle's going to do it for you. Then all you have to do is squeeze that gently until it's all gone. I always train it out as 1 bottle, 1 eye, 1 minute. You start the washing in the first minute, use the full contents. You've fully decontaminated an eye. So it does make the whole process a lot simpler. And similarly with the aerosol sprays, it is a really, all you have to do with this one is pop the top off. And if I spray it, it's a really fine mist. Hopefully, I'm struggling with the background. I keep disappearing in and out of it. But it flushes really quickly. But I could decontaminate all of somebody's face in 50 seconds rather than 15 minutes in a shower. So it makes our first aider's life so much easier.
Yeah, it's a really great demo. Thank you, Kate.
Yeah.
I think that's it from everyone. So thank you all for coming today. I think there'll be a survey that pops up when you leave the presentation. So if you could please complete that, that's really useful to us so that we can arrange our webinars in future. And just want to thank Kate again for coming along today, and to all of you for joining us. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Lauren. And if anybody does have any questions that suddenly pop up, please just feel free to get in contact, or if you want to talk about your specific site and some concerns, then more than happy to help.
Great. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Bye.